Hello everyone, welcome to AP Sources Simplified. We are in the middle of our AP exam review, and just a reminder, these videos go along with an exam review assignment my students complete to help them prepare for the AP test. If you're interested in the review, it is in the links in the video information below. Today we are looking at the continuities and changes over time of the social position of African Americans from 1865 to 1900. This time period coincides with both Reconstruction in the first part and the beginning of segregation in the second part. The famous image below helps describe the first part of this era. It shows a Freedmen's Bureau agent from the federal government holding back an angry white mob. Sadly, this federal intervention and protection would not last long. First, let's take a look at the legal changes that occurred during the time period. Shortly after the Civil War, the newly freed slaves had to deal with black codes that the white, now former Confederates, passed in many towns and counties across the South. These codes severely restricted African Americans in every aspect of life. However, when radical Republicans in Congress took control of Reconstruction, further boosted by the electoral victory of former General Ulysses S. Grant in 1868, the federal government became way more involved in guaranteeing rights of African Americans. They enforced the 13th Amendment as black codes were done away with, passed new amendments, including the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing rights and citizenship to former slaves, and passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. However, as a side note, not gender, which angered women's suffrage supporters. But the Supreme Court would deal a series of legal blows to equality for African Americans in two specific cases. The first is what was referred to as the slaughterhouse cases, in which the ruling narrowed the rights of African Americans and said the 13th and 14th Amendments did not apply in economic situations. The next case is the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson, which cemented Southern laws segregating the races. If you'd like more detail about this landmark case, I made a short video about it and you can find it on this YouTube page. Now, taking a look at some more changes that impacted African Americans, there were some attempts by the federal government, specifically radical Republicans and the Grant administration, to help African Americans in the South. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, which is one of the first instances of direct aid from the federal government to large swaths of citizens. The Freedmen's Bureau helped find family members that were sold away during slavery, also legalized marriages that occurred on slave plantations, and helped educate the newly freedmen. There also were attempts at helping African Americans start businesses and banking through the Freedmen's Savings Bank, although, like a lot of departments in the Grant administration, it was hopelessly corrupt. Then a big change happened with the Compromise of 1877. The election of 1876 was really close and produced no clear electoral winner, so it went to the House of Representatives. A bargain was struck between Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans that they would give the election to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in return for an end of Reconstruction and federal occupation of the South. The Republicans agreed, and that spelled the end of Reconstruction, along with the previously mentioned Supreme Court decision spelled doom for African Americans, as they would then be completely shut out of political power and regulated to the bottom of the social ladder. Another continuity was the racial violence and terrorism against African Americans. Freed slaves were met with hostility from Southern whites throughout the time period. The Ku Klux Klan and the Redeemers were a couple of groups that terrorized African Americans. There were two instances in particular that stand out. One was the New Orleans Massacre of 1866, and the other was the Memphis Riots of 1866. These two instances showcase horrific violence against the newly freedmen, as hundreds were killed. This was also the beginning of the Jim Crow, or segregation, and many lynchings would begin in this era and occur over the next several decades. The South will have de jure, meaning segregation by law, and the North will have de facto, meaning segregation by custom. And segregation will last until the second half of the 20th century. The last continuity I want to discuss is the continued subordinate economic position of African Americans. We started the era with the end of slavery, and while what replaced was not technically slavery, it kept African Americans from the ability to ever rise up the social and economic ladder, and that system was sharecropping. It involved the sharecropper receiving land and seed that would typically be an African American, although some poor whites were also involved in this system. And in exchange for the land and seed, he promised to give the landowner half of the crop once it was ready to be picked. The sharecropper buys food and clothing at a credit from the landowner's store, and then the sharecropper plants and harvests the crop. The sharecropper then gives the landowner a crop to sell, and the sharecropper gets half the earnings, minus his debt for the year. When settling up, the landowner says the sharecropper owes more than he has earned. To pay the debt, the sharecropper has to promise the landowner a greater share of his next year's crop. By the time the sharecropper had shared their crops and paid their debts, they rarely had any money left. The sharecropper became tied to one plantation, having to work until his debts were paid, and they were never paid. Okay, that does it for the social position of African Americans from 1865 to 1900. Subscribe to the channel for more AP test review.